Michael, welcome to the pod. We last saw each other at the Great Tech SEO Connect conference, as well as Spark Together, making that conference circuit. And what excited me about just what I happened into and talking to you is you have a very cool tool that is getting in front of change in our industry, essentially rank tracking for AI search services like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Claude. Knowatoa is the name, and we go way back. You're a former demand gen at a well-known public B2B company, and you led SEO there, so you know what you're talking about. So I'm excited to have you on and kind of chat through this new world we're in.
Yeah, this is awesome. So, I've had an interesting, varied career path, and so it's brought me back to interacting more with the SEO and marketing world. And I went to those conferences really to learn, to talk to folks like yourself and others about the changes and where things are at, and trying to build something. It feels like a good step is talking to people first. So
yeah. That's great. That's a great way to learn and get the product right and all those good things. So for context, I mean, I have the feeling in the case this might be one of the first conversations people have heard of you. It probably, I'm anticipating, will be much different in 6 to 12 months, but because it's the first time that maybe people have heard of the Knowatoa tool that are in our audience, just to give context, you'd put like your company Siege Media in there, and then it will give you questions that you should potentially rank for within AI search engines that are bottom funnel. And for example, you might ask, what is the best content marketing agency? And then your tool will tell me where we rank relative to competitors as well in all the varied search engines with different permutations of that.
Yeah.
It as well. That fair to say?
That's exactly it. So, it's exactly it, which is, and I think, sort of the starting point for this is that, I run some other SaaS companies. I was talking to some other SaaS founders, 6-8 months ago, and it came up like, oh, we're using these tools more and more, especially in the developer space. And we put our name into ChatGPT. Oh, why aren't we there? We should be there. And then, I wrote like literally a script that ran on my computer that spit out a CSV, and I was sending it around to folks, like as a Google sheet to be like, oh, here's where you're at this week. Here's this other, and all this stuff. And then it's just slowly become, more and more demand. And now it's an actual service people can go and use. And, it's been up less than a month. Going to the conferences, was trying to get a little early feedback on it. We're just about to launch our third version of it, which is mostly all the same data, just presented in more and more coherent ways, and very excited about it. So
yeah, I like the first spin on it, and that wasn't an ad up front, just giving people context. But I mean, clearly this is going to be something that we're all monitoring at some point. You're the first person I've seen do it, so cheers for that. And I mean, a natural byproduct that's probably makes this turn to actionability beyond using the tool and monitoring those rankings, as you've kind of looked at this and thought about the problem and all of those things. Like the SEOs and content marketers that listen to this program, their natural inclination will be, how do I influence these results? How do I rank for them? And you've, I think, have some thoughts on those. How would people go about doing that, in your opinion?
Sure. So I think, you of course have to start with search intent, and, where people are looking for information. And this differs across the different services. So for an example, we do a lot of what I call like data source mapping, like where are these places getting their information from? What are they doing? And so, just as an example, Claude doesn't really look at LinkedIn. That's because Claude has a different set of data that they search for. So if you're trying to influence, what's in Claude and your rankings there, you want to look at, maybe something like Common Crawl or these other data sources. But if you're in a situation where you're trying to influence ChatGPT, which has this big relationship with Microsoft, LinkedIn's owned by Microsoft. They've stated we use LinkedIn data. There was a whole, hullabaloo around data inclusion. That's a great place to go. And then what Knowatoa is trying to do is find the opportunities. to be able to say like, well, for these like high intent questions, like, does your tool work with Office 365? Like, does it provide security for that or only for Google domains? Like, that's an important thing to get out there. That's an important thing people could be asking this. You want to make sure it has the right answer across all of these. And, that's really those opportunities. Then it's very easy to turn around and write that content. Like, yeah, we're great at Office 365. That's a great post to put on LinkedIn. So I think that's the sort of generalized pattern that I recommend to people. So.
Is there, you kind of hinted at it, but just put more color on it. Would there be scenarios where you specifically, I mean, in today's world for search engines, we care more about Google than Bing, but would you want to care to influence one search service or over the other in particular? Like,
oh, well, so this space is moving very fast. So,
yeah.
And I think there's some other pieces of this we can get into. But so I think a really good example now is Rufus. I don't know if you're familiar with Rufus.
No, I'm not.
So they're on the front page of a small e-commerce site called Amazon.com. And so Amazon.com, every single Amazon app, every single Amazon visit has a Rufus button there. And you can ask it any question like, hey, what's a good mirrorless camera? What's a good, XYZ? What's the difference between this and that? And what it is it's Claude mixed with Amazon data. So they've brought in their product data, they've brought in their review data and passed it through Claude, and that's what you get. And it literally is Claude because you can go into it and like ask those product questions. You can also go in and say like, hey, write me a hello world script in Python. It will write you a hello world script in Python. Like, it's weird. And, a month ago, like those kind of questions, you can't ask that in the bar that's at the top. You can't ask like, does the ZV-10, mirrorless camera overheat? Like, it won't answer that. Rufus will answer that. And these are things that are being pulled directly out of, Google search volume. And it's not that, and, so at the conferences, I think there's a lot of stress in the SEO community currently and a lot of concern. And I really have come at this the whole other way, which is that I am very optimistic for SEOs as a profession. And I think there's going to be tremendous demand because for so long, I think SEO has really meant Google optimization. Like, maybe Bing, but really it's been Google optimization. And I think we're really rapidly entering a world where you need to think a lot more about content across a whole lot more platforms and to be a lot more strategic and do a lot more work and, very, I think, high level effort and strategy in a way that wasn't there before. Again, so I think it's a tremendous opportunity for SEOs that are on the cutting edge of this stuff.
Yeah. Keeps it interesting. So to restate it back to you, what I'm hearing, especially if your probably if your products are on Amazon as an e-commerce brand, you should think specifically about how to influence Claude because the weighting to that is probably far more important to you on average. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. So like as a general, so people I think are a couple different ways to come at this. As a general recommendation, there's sort of a maturity model for this, which is, like you have a site. What's one of the first things you do for every site that comes online? You put it in Search Console, Google Search Console, just to see like, hey, is this going to get traffic? Is it recognized? Just like the base level technology. I think you should do essentially that for these different AI search services. Like, do I show up? Have I done something weird with my Cloudflare rules to get rid of like SEO bots that are scraping me and accidentally cut out like it's not the standard Google bot user agent that picks up for Gemini. It's very easy to accidentally block that. And now suddenly you're not showing in Gemini results. Same for Claude, same for ChatGPT, for all these different services. So that's base one. Just make sure like at least it's indexing you, you're showing up. Step two is I think sentiment. Like if you go into ChatGPT and ask like, was Enron a good company? It will tell you flatly no. It will say no. They're known for fraud. They're known for all these bad things. And you can ask that of any company. Like, is this a good company? About my former company, where I work for, they pretty much nailed it, which is it says their software is very expensive, but it's worth it. And that, if you were having drinks with a friend at, a tech conference and they say like, is this any good? You'd be like, it's expensive, but it does what it says. It does it really well. It's worth it, you know? And then I think the third step is really where Knowatoa, and we're trying to do all of this, but we're sort of coming in at the top, which is the competitiveness, which is head to head. People are asking questions with economic impact to ChatGPT, to Perplexity, to Claude, that you want to make sure you are doing better than your competitors. You want to make sure that the information that's in there is correct. Yeah, and that's what we're trying to achieve. So
Nice. Yeah, you one of the takeaways I actually immediately shared with our team that's an output from your tool that I thought was smart was just the idea to check robots.txt to make sure you're not blocking these different tools from accessing your website. I know we immediately started down the path as an industry of like, it behooves us to block these in many instances out of paranoia and what have you. And maybe some people still have that stance, but if I bet the tide would turn pretty quickly if ChatGPT becomes 10% of the search pie.
yeah,
Right.
and I think we're at a real change in the industry, and there's different pieces of this. Again, like I think I'm like weirdly positive on this compared to everyone else, but um, you know, I think maybe we're at peak traditional search, like peak traditional search of like you put a term in, you get 10 blue links, that kind of search. And maybe and that, I guess, to be clear, that doesn't mean like death of SEO, that doesn't mean death of Google, that doesn't mean these things are going away, but I think they're really changing. And we're seeing both not just like a one-to-one flip of people looking in ChatGPT, they're entering questions in there that they used to ask in Google. We're actually seeing larger shifts of like, just I call like search evaporation, which is like in the dev space, there is just less search volume happening for almost every development keyword, for like errors, for all sorts of stuff, because the AI tools are just handling it like right away. So what used to be like, hey, how do I write this loop? How do I do this stuff? How do I iterate over it and then stop at the right time? Like that would be like half a dozen questions I used to ask of Google. And, now that's just going away. And instead, you know, there's a whole other set of, things you need to do to rank and have things work properly. So
Yeah, I know Stack Overflow, last I checked or heard in the industry, the search traffic had just cratered.
I think they're down around like
That's,
35-40% like year over year.
yeah.
And they were on a real high trajectory. Like, um, this is sort of another way to think about it. And this was actually suggested to me by someone who I met at Spark Together. Um, and it's that ChatGPT is like an untrained sales rep for your company. Like, I know, Siege, you talk to a lot of people, people are asking questions of ChatGPT now of like, not just like what is a good, SEO company, what's a good content strategy company, like who is good at these things, but they're asking stuff like, do you handle this? What is the right way to deal with this? Like, do you, all of these sort of questions. And by blocking the indexing of your site, you're really blocking the training for this sales rep that's out there, answering all these front level questions. So
Yeah, makes sense. And just to fact check myself, I mean, this is just what Ahrefs says, but it does actually say they're relatively up. I haven't diagnosed if it's brand search and what have you, and quickly show for people who are watching this on YouTube.
okay.
And probably should get into their content section. But it was up here, which is still, if we narrow in, it went from like at peak 28 million in traffic to, I mean, that is, I guess it's just volatile, but
I looked
reportedly 15. Yeah.
Yeah, I looked on SimilarWeb, I think yesterday,
Okay.
and it showed like a
Yeah.
40% drop. All these tools
That,
are struggling with, volume, but yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. So, assuming obviously we do need to think this way and go in that direction as an industry. You specifically called out, you gave some tips at the top of the podcast
Yeah.
of how to fall in there, and perhaps this fits in one of them, but just to continue to build on it, it's called a COPE content strategy. Could you give a little more detail on that?
Sure. I don't think this is something that, is um, unique to AI. And so it's just, you're creating once and you're putting this content out everywhere. Create once, publish everywhere. And I think if there's a difference with AI versus traditional, like, this is something where not SEO, but content marketing, where you would write a piece of content and then you'd chop it up into a carousel you put on LinkedIn, and you take screenshots of it and put it in a carousel on Instagram, and you'd write a video for YouTube, and you'd use that same piece of content different ways. I think what changes with AI is that you need to be a little more deliberate about like actually saying the very specific things you do, and really trying to fill in all those gaps, sort of as, almost like an FAQ or like a buyer's guide type content.
Hmm.
Again, to think about training this untrained, resource that's coming in. So
Makes sense. Yeah, I see. I mean, in some way, is that's also just good user experience. Not everyone might want to publish that, but hopefully it's more argument. We do increasingly recommend on like bottom funnel sales pages that they have that FAQ block in there. But
smart.
makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it further would help this.
Yeah. So I'm not sure quite what you want to talk about, but something that I get asked a lot from the conferences is, you know, or I guess it's a feeling I get, which is that it's very hard to influence these services. Like, do they actually update? Like, what does that actually mean? What happens? And I think there's a real sense, and maybe this is even just a language issue, where people talk a lot about LLM models versus services. And a couple interesting distinctions there. So the models are very fixed. Like, um, the easiest one to consider is Meta. Meta puts out these llama models that you can download and like run on your Mac, use your stuff. They don't really interact with other things. But the services where you go to a website and you interact with them, they're actually reaching outside of that model to do stuff. Like, a real easy one to think about is you can ask ChatGPT, hey, what's the date today? Like, that's not baked into the model. It didn't read a document that said like today is October Thursday. You know, it's going out to the system and it's asking, hey, like, what is the date today? And then it's bringing it back to you. At a certain point, it also goes like, hey, I don't know what this is. I'm going to reach out and do a web search for you. And a couple pieces there. So the models are fixed, but the services definitely are not. And so from our perspective, in terms of like trying to rank track and to see a trend of like, are you doing better? Are you doing worse? ChatGPT in the last 2 years has seen 11 updates. So that's been 11 distinct times where they've either changed the underlying model, they've changed the data that is going into it, or they've changed the relative rankings. Like in the search terminology, this would be like, an algorithm update, like,
Yeah.
and so there's been 11 times where you've had an opportunity to do better or worse and to find out like, what has happened. Which is, I think that's a lot. There's a lot of volatility there. And again, a lot of opportunity to jump in and get ahead of these things. So
Is that I'm guessing I mean I've seen it like they might just announce on Twitter or something like that. That might be a feature idea for you to kind of show that trend over time or something, or when they've launched new data.
yeah.
Um, I think that could be useful. I know Ahrefs tracks that for Google.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a lot more pronounced with the AI search services. I think that the other interesting thing is, um, I'm very focused on search. You're obviously very focused on search and marketing and things. And there's a sense of like, oh, well, ChatGPT, this is a competitor to Google. A crazy thing to think about is they did not set out to do that. They made a Google competitor on accident, trying to build this more general AI tool. And so I talked to a lot of other AI folk, and they are the opposite. They forget about search. They forget that it's a competitor because they're working on robotics, because they're working on, some military thing, or they're working on data analysis with machine learning and all these other systems. And they're like, oh yeah, it does search too. That's interesting. Like, so, um, and so from that, my take is that we haven't even actually seen them try to be a competitor, where, when you put in a Google search, there's like 120 different things it splits out. It goes like, oh, this looks like an address, I should send them to Maps. This looks like, a restaurant, I should do something. This looks like a technical thing, should I give an ad? Like, all that classification. Basically none of that classification happens in any of the AI search services right now. They're just like brute forcing this to happen. And as Search GPT comes out, as these other services get better, as they actually start trying, I think this is just going to become more and more of a real competition with traditional, search. So
Yeah, I noticed Gemini is actually doing a decent version. I mean, they're pushing out this to external websites
Mhm.
at a high speed, and I still haven't gotten access to Search GPT personally. But I was actually surprised when that came out, and somewhere like I was like, yeah, as you mentioned, it's sort of an accident, but that seems like the search engine to me. It's just ChatGPT, but
yeah,
anyways, but
it's
yeah,
there's I think there's a real sense as well, like, oh, this AI is this like super techie thing, like, oh, like it's just technical people that are using it. It's not going to be other people. But if we actually look at the AI services that have come out and like achieved widespread adoption, everybody is using them. And, the things I think about are like, we're all taking pictures with our smartphones. Almost every picture we take is, digitally enhanced at some level with a machine learning algorithm to like overcome certain deficiencies of them. Um, and that's just what happens. Of course, like stuff like Snapchat filters and things. But, Google in their Q3 announcement said 1 billion people have interacted with, AI overviews. That's mainstream,
yeah, yeah.
Um,
People are liking.
and it's not hard to go to ChatGPT and ask it a question. It's not like you're building something, it's not any technically harder than going to Google. It's really just, I think, a lot of habit and what's built into things. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see how it evolves,
Mhm.
for sure. But I'm with you, generally. Like, I wouldn't say I'm like I run an SEO content company. I'm not. I'm generally optimistic person. I mean, I think it's possible the overall kind of impact is 10-20% on like referral traffic to websites, but I'm not like the end of the world in any fashion. And that could take a long time too. We'll see.
That
It
could
depends on who you are. Yeah.
that could take a long time. And I think there's a phrase which is like the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think that's really true in this
Good
case.
quote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
William Gibson. Um, and I think that's the case. Like, there is a lot of different groups under the umbrella of SEO, and local SEO for lawyers in Chicago is going to look real different than like this giant SaaS service that works for everybody. That's going to work real different than like my e-commerce store that I've been running and have 20,000 products in. Like, those are three real different things with three real different requirements and like usage patterns and people. So, what makes sense for one might not make sense for the other. Right now, I think Knowatoa and makes the most sense really for SaaS businesses and for businesses that have a global reach. And mostly that's because ChatGPT doesn't know where you are. It doesn't have GPS in it. Like, you can ask it for like, what's a good lawyer? Who's a good lawyer in Chicago? It doesn't really know automatically where you're at and doesn't have that additional context. And I think it's going to be held back from that. But I think there are also, like, I've talked to a lot of people in other industries, and they are also like, a refrain I hear a lot is, I'm using this in ways I wasn't using things before, where it's more conversational, it's more in depth, it's more ongoing, some of the discussions. And I think that's really interesting. So,
Yeah. I mean, we've seen anecdotally our ChatGPT traffic is higher than Bing for the first time
Mhm.
in the last couple of weeks. So it's definitely on the rise in the B2B kind of
And
sector. Yeah.
like a real pattern I see is people do research in the LLMs and then they do a navigational search in Google because a lot of times it's not linked. Like
Mm.
if you look for, hey, what's the best email service for my small business? Like if you ask that in ChatGPT, you don't really get links, and it'll have Mailchimp and ConvertKit and all these other things just listed out, and it's easy enough just to tab into ConvertKit and go to the site. But um, so I think there's still a blend of these, and I think search journeys are just going to look a little different. What people are doing is going to look a little different. And again, I think
Yeah.
it again, I think there's I've said again way too many times, but I think
Yeah.
there's real opportunity and I think still some real challenges with like from a jobs to be done standpoint, what Google and traditional search has given us for so long. I think now there's suddenly so many more competitors for where there's so many other new ways to get answers for this stuff. Like here's an example, like Notion's this online document, collaboration, you make lists in it kind of stuff. It, a year ago, it was not a competitor to Google. There's no way for it to influence search volume, but now it has AI tools in it. So you can go into it and you can just type like, hey, make me a to-do list for this. Like I'm gonna start my own podcast. Make me a to-do list. And it just creates 10 items for you. And then any one of those items, you just say, make me 5 more in here. So it's like, hey, you need to get a podcast host. So great. Give me a list of 5 podcast hosts. And it would give you a list of 5 podcast hosts. And you're like, great. Now I need to buy a microphone. Give me a list of give me a list of all the stuff I need to buy. Like these are things that used to be dozens of searches to try, and we're all familiar with this. Of like, I look at the top 5 links, I kind of pick out which one's best for me that I think. I go to it, I pull a couple items out of it, I put it in a mental list or maybe an actual list in Notion, and then I go and I make this document at the end, and the AI stuff sort of jumps over a lot of that. And I think, comes up with the product at the end and sort of evaporates those other searches, but it doesn't evaporate the need for SEOs.
Transaction. Yeah.
Yeah. To figure out and to be in those things. Like, because
Yeah. Increasingly I mean, you'll probably build this, maybe you're already building this, but like just that overall, one of the immediate things that came top of mind for me is how we're as SEOs just needing to report on mentions in these services. Like if we can truly have a clear or causative, ideally, but probably correlative, like tracking of we did something to our mentions went up and then sales went up through brand traffic. Like we probably need to show, hey, we were mentioned in positive sentiment to your previous point X amount of times in all these kind of relevant searches. And that's even if it's not linked, if brand search is going up, that's probably a positive
oh,
kind of signal. Yeah.
I think brand is very important. I think, being active in these different places are really important. Like you mentioned, something we're building, everyone is fighting for Reddit because Reddit, comes up so much in traditional search now. But, almost all of the big players have cut, multi-million dollar deals to access Reddit's traffic. And they're doing that so they can then use use all of that content to build better models, to build smarter models, to build models that, work in this way. And so something we are definitely going to launch is like, like anytime someone mentions Siege Media on Reddit, you'll get an alert from us that says like, hey, you're mentioned. Oh, your competitor's mentioned, and you can expand that out and do different things just because that is such a big source of data for so many of these different search services.
So we had that kind of first question. You kind of gave a top level view. I'm curious, either one or two directions. One, I know it's so early, so it's hard to kind of strong give a case study of like this happened, and then this new model release came out, one of those 11 releases, and now I'm showing up more often. If you have any kind of even anecdotal stories like that, I think that'd be interesting. And second point connected to that, maybe it's the same thing it's just more like that same question everyone has. And I'm personally curious is like, what are the differing actions I would take for AI search compared to SEO to influence it?
Sure. So first of all, apologies for talking over you. I'm trying my
No
best.
worries.
That wasn't intentional. Um, Second, as far as case studies, you're not alone in seeing like an uptick in traffic, like from ChatGPT and referrals. And so some of the other SaaS people I mentioned, my fellow SaaS founders for stuff who were in that early group that I was sending spreadsheets around to in the early form of this. One of them was Justin Jackson from Transistor FM, which is a podcast hosting site. And he has done a lot more of this ground level work on Reddit, on these other forums and social, and punches above his weight in AI search results compared to his much bigger competitors, where he's very much a challenger brand. They're very successful, but he's not Spotify,
Yeah.
understandably. Who is? So I think that's a good case study. And I think that's a real clear one to look at traditional, like you can just yourself, just look at traditional SEO rankings and then look at like what ChatGPT says. And he does much better because he's put in the work and built a great business. So I think as far as case studies, I think it's awesome. I think it's a pattern people should emulate. You mentioned,
So you're saying he's actively just trying to get mention on Reddit and social media in particular to influence that?
I think because I've been tracking his stuff since the early days, his actions doing that were to positively, I think was more community outreach, that he was doing that before ChatGPT was even launched. But because he invested in that and, he does not have the backlinks that Spotify has, he doesn't have the brand mentions that Spotify has, that directly translated into him as a challenger brand outranking a lot of other competitors in LLMs versus, traditional search.
Well, you make me think, and correct me if you push back on this idea, like that might even like indirectly increase the value of a role like a social media specialist who would own some of those conversations and aim to increase them. Do you
Oh,
agree with
absolutely.
that?
I think,
Yeah,
yeah, I think digital PR people, I think are going to be worth
that's us.
weight in gold, Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think, that level of, not reviews in the sense of like G2 crowd or something, but like, other people stating things about your company. a- all of that gets mushed together into like what ChatGPT thinks of you. In a sense, it's like an internet level brand, sentiment, mentioning tracking system. And, it has, I think we're seeing it has real economic value now as people are looking to it for explanations of things, for what they should do, for all sorts of stuff. So,
Yeah, one of the kind of go-to strategies that we have that's our kind of main recommendation for this that we'd still do on Google regardless is to create like best X roundups, especially in B2B. Like we're talking about this is influential in B2B, but like we rank for best content marketing agency. And if you run us on many of these tools, our own website will show up as a source for us why we're number one.
yeah,
But I do think that also, if you're actually that, the other people doing research will research you and then also include you in their articles, kind of increasing the corpus of that. So like you still need to be good. You can't just make that article and be doo-doo and expect to like show up number one in these other articles. But if you are good, you can partially influence it that way. At least that's been my opinion. I'm
yeah.
curious what you think about that.
And
Yeah.
I think because it's early days, I think there are more opportunities. And I think a lot of this right now is, and this is what we're trying to surface with the tool, is just what are those opportunities that there's, probably a couple dozen like high intent questions you want to make sure you show up in. If you don't show up in one, you should write an article for that. Like, and that's, but you should write it both for traditional SEO, for ranking an AI search, for communicating, to have something that you can give to your sales team that they can send around, like it's positive for all of those things. And again, I think that's why I'm positive on this is not the death of SEO. This is the start of a lot of like really good work and leverage that we can do. So
Yeah, related to that, and like, there's the idea of influencing the corpus, and the more times you show up in the corpus, the more likely you're supposed to show up. I'm not the developer that you are, but my brain naturally goes to Google's kind of uh, domain, or man, I forget their original PR, or wait, no, what was it called? PageRank
yeah,
algorithm, which, wow, I can't believe I almost forgot that, of the quality of the link, not just the quantity. Do you believe currently it's sort of a quantity system, or will this all eventually converge at a very similar PageRank model for these? Yeah.
yeah. I think in a lot of ways, AI right now, like I said, they are not, they did not set out to be a search engine. And so they literally were just taking mountains of text from wherever they could get them in a lot of cases. Like, oh, here's this thing of like old books. That's all, open to me, whatever they could get to do the training on this. So it doesn't have a lot of those specific tweaks. And a lot of like the early AI researchers were actually doing things like, oh, it's I put white text on a white background on my website and I know it's being included because I wrote the crawler. So it comes up with like, Mike is awesome. Like, who's Mike Buckbee? The awesomest guy in the world, because that's what they put in the text. Like they were doing like dumb SEO tricks from like decades ago. And it worked because, of the limited amount of data. And so, yeah, I think it's,
I mean, do you think so? What I'm hearing, it sounds like you roughly agree with that. There's probably two scenarios. One, there's like a short to midterm world where, I mean, maybe they don't care and they continue this path. That maybe that's an answer too. But a short and midterm world where it's just kind of the size of the corpus, and there's definitely kind of optimization opportunities to take
sure.
advantage of that kind of in a manipulative gray hat, black hat ish way. But then there's also just think mid to long term and act as I would as a brand. I guess the question is if you think that first part is going to close, how fast is it going to close? And should people just think the long term way, or because it's moving so fast, or is there going to be a long enough timeline of it just being that corpus idea that maybe it does behoove people to really be deliberate in that action?
Um, I think there's a couple pieces of this. I think maybe a thing I've said again a couple of times, but one of which is that the reason they're paying so much money for access to these data sources, to Reddit and LinkedIn and the Atlantic, these are all press releases they put out, is because there is a certain quality level that comes with that. Like Reddit is not hard to get into; anyone can go and post stuff, but certainly they try to do like anti-spam bots, and they try to look at older sets of data versus newer sets and all sorts of things. And there's an element of that. I think the most rapid opportunity, like a term we haven't used is hallucinations, that people bring up a lot, for AI. And hallucinations are lack of data. Like if it's hallucinating about what your company is doing, that means that it like looked above it and it looked below it, quote unquote, in the in the database, and didn't find something there and made it up. And so, hallucinations are an opportunity from the SEO perspective to put the right information out there. So I think that's a lot of the white hat sort of part of this. And I think the black hat, I'm sure people are going to do crazy, crazy spam things, but also, I think this is just an element of a larger marketing brand push that, regardless of how you want to rank in AI tools, you probably still want to look like, a not insane company on Reddit. You want to look like,
Yeah, yeah.
a reasonable company on LinkedIn. You want to look like, across the board for these things. So I think that's that's the easiest. I think that's the optimum path. And that's what I'm pitching to people is like, you should keep doing marketing. You should keep doing SEO. You should broaden your idea of what exactly that means. But all of these pieces are directionally positive. It's really hard to look at them and go like, this is really going to hurt us. Most of this stuff is not also $1 million to get started, like it's reasonable, positive things that are good for companies and good for communications. So
Makes sense. Your aside thought bubble you gave me when you were talking about, obviously they buy the data from these more reputable sources by default. I'm guessing it may be a little bit easier to weight something that you purchase data from, such as a LinkedIn or a Reddit of the world, in the model. Again, I'm not a developer, but the way these things work, or just the way, like, is it even feasible for some kind of link graph model to exist within these, or am I?
I think this goes to the difference between a model and a service. I
Yeah.
think,
Okay.
so not within a model, but there's nothing to stop them from taking the results of like what comes out of that and then putting links on it and putting a link graph model on it. If you look at a lot of the hybrid services, like Perplexity is one, that's doing both. It gives you an answer, it gives you a set of links. They're doing their own model for what they show when. There's a variety of other services that are also trying to do that. And there's a real interplay between all of this stuff. Like going back to AIO, Google has said AIO is based at least in part on the Gemini models of stuff. So they have, their current ranking that then shows an AIO that's based on Gemini. And so certainly you want to be in Gemini to be in AIOs. It's all a mashup of all of these different things to try to get something that's quality. So
Yeah, makes sense. It's a moving target, and we'll just have to keep tracking it. But your tool will hopefully do a lot of that, Mike. And where I mean, people should go find you on LinkedIn. Of course, go check out the tool Knowatoa. Anywhere else, people should catch up with you or check out.
those are the two best ways. I'm trying to figure out if I should stay on Twitter or not. So it's been a mixed bag, but yeah. So I think we're all there.
We gotta influence those tools. Is anyone buying the X data, to your knowledge, off the top of your head?
That's a good question. We don't actually track Grok right now, which is Elon Musk's, because their API issues. But yeah, well, maybe people ask for it. So
yeah, nice. Well, this has been a lot to noodle on, Michael. I appreciate it. Yeah, I feel like I already have a few actions in my head. So I'm sure people are getting a lot out of this. So thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ross. This is awesome. So long time listener, and it's cool to be here. So
cheers.